At least your sister had the sense to marry well. My mother said it the way she said everything, clearly, calmly, the way you'd state a fact about the weather. 14 people heard it. 14 people who shared my blood, who'd eaten at my table, who'd sent me birthday cards with my name spelled correctly for 38 years. She didn't lower her voice. She didn't check whether I was in earshot. She said it to my aunt across the kitchen island at my niece's christening, loud enough that the catering staff paused, and 14 people found somewhere else to look. I was standing 6 feet away holding a glass of sparkling water I hadn't touched. My sister, Paige, was across the room in a white silk blouse that cost more than my car payment, laughing at something her husband said. He was in commercial real estate. My mother mentioned this approximately once every 40 minutes at family events. He was in commercial real estate, and Paige had 2 kids and a house in Oakville with heated floors in the kitchen. And my mother brought all of this up the way some people bring up scripture. Regularly, with reverence, and with the clear implication that it was the only text that mattered. I was a forensic accountant with the Canada Revenue Agencies. I'd spent the last 11 years tracing financial crimes through offshore accounts and shell companies and layered transactions most people needed a flowchart to understand. I had a file on my desk that week with 17 entities and 46 months of bank records. I'd sent 2 men to prison the previous spring. My mother thought I did paperwork for the government. She never did know how to take care of herself, she continued louder. Always so focused on work. What's the point of all that education if you don't build a life? 14 people. Not one of them said a word. My cousin Owen stared at his shoes. My aunt busied herself refilling a punch bowl that was already full. I set my glass down on the nearest flat surface. I didn't set it down gently. I set it down with a single, deliberate sound that cut through the ambient noise of the christening, and I looked at my mother across the kitchen. I said one word, Meridian. The catering staff member nearest me stopped mid-step. My aunt looked up from the punch bowl. My cousin Owen's head came up from his shoes like he'd heard his name called in a courtroom. And from the far end of the kitchen, near the back door where he'd been standing alone with a cup of coffee, a man named Lawrence, who had been a senior investigator with the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit for 29 years before he retired, set his mug down so hard it cracked the saucer. He turned around and looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at my mother, then back at me. "Holy God," he said, quietly enough that only the people within 3 meters heard it. "That's your daughter?" But before I tell you why a man who had spent 3 decades untangling the worst financial crimes in Canadian history went pale at a single word, and who paid the price that night for 43 combined years of looking the other way, subscribe to this channel and hit that like button, because what happened next is something no one in that kitchen was ready for. Lawrence had worked under my supervisor's supervisor before his retirement. He'd been a legend inside the unit for a case in 2009 called Meridian, a tax evasion network that ran through numbered companies in Alberta and British Columbia, eventually connecting to real estate fraud and money laundering operations with ties to organized crime. The case had taken 4 years to build. It had resulted in 11 convictions and was still referenced in training modules as the textbook example of multi-jurisdictional financial investigation. I had led the team that built the supporting case structure for the final prosecution phase. My name was not in any of the public coverage. My name was never in public coverage. That was the nature of the work. The people who knew, knew. The people who didn't, and you didn't explain it at christenings. Lawrence crossed the kitchen in 12 steps. He was 67 years old, broad through the shoulders in a way that hadn't entirely gone with age, wearing a dark gray jacket slightly too formal for the occasion because that was the kind of man he was. Someone who never quite learned to dress down. He stopped in front of me. Meridian. He said the word back to me like a question. I nodded once. He turned to face the room, not theatrically, not with any particular drama, just turned the way a man turns when he has something to say and wants to be sure he's facing the right direction when he says it. For anyone who doesn't know, he began, and his voice carried the particular quiet authority of a person who had spent decades in rooms where raising your voice was a sign of weakness. The Meridian case recovered $63 million in hidden assets for Canadian taxpayers. It resulted in 11 criminal convictions and the single largest tax evasion penalty ever issued by the CRA at the time. He paused. The investigator who built the evidentiary framework that made the prosecution possible was not named in any press release, because that is how this work is done. But I know who she is. He looked at me, because when I couldn't sleep the night before the closing arguments, I read the case file for 6 hours. And I called my former director the next morning and asked him who had done the analysis on the shell company mapping. Another pause. He told me it was a woman named Leigh, 3rd year in the unit, 31 years old. My mother said nothing. For the first time in 14 people's memory, my mother said absolutely nothing. But before I could breathe, before anyone could absorb what Lawrence had just said, My mother found her footing again. She always found her footing. It was the thing I had spent 38 years watching her do: take a hit, absorb it, and recalibrate without ever fully losing her balance. Lawrence, that's very kind. Her voice settled back into its warmth, patient, measured. The tone of someone explaining something obvious to someone who'd temporarily misunderstood. We're all very proud of Leigh's career. She's always been very dedicated. A small pause. We just worry sometimes. All that time alone, no real roots. You know how it gets. Paige materialized beside her on cue, phone in one hand, brow slightly creased in manufactured concern. Are you doing okay, Leigh? You seem stressed. You don't have to get defensive. We're family. The question was precision engineered. It didn't dispute Lawrence. It didn't deny anything. It simply repositioned me. From someone worthy of a senior investigator's acknowledgement to someone who needed to be managed, not accomplished, unstable, not decorated, overworked and brittle and probably in need of a vacation. I looked at my sister. I looked at the way she'd arranged her face. Sympathetic, soft-edged, the exact expression she'd been performing since we were children, the one that said, "I'm not involved in this, I'm just concerned," which was the most sophisticated lie she'd ever learned to tell, and she'd had 36 years of practice. I set down the glass I'd picked back up. 4 counts in, 4 counts hold, 4 counts out. My mother filled the silence again before I could. She's always been sensitive about the job, she said to my aunt, lowering her voice just enough to perform privacy while keeping it audible. You know how she gets. Ever since she was a child, she took everything so personally. I walked out of the kitchen and sat in my car in my sister's driveway for 40 minutes. The memories didn't arrive in order. They never do. They came the way evidence arrives. Fragments, pieces, things that don't seem connected until you lay them flat and let the pattern emerge. The year I passed my CPA exam, my mother mentioned it once at dinner, and then spent the rest of the evening talking about Paige's engagement. The year I received my first commendation from the unit director, I mentioned it to my mother on the phone. She said, "Oh, that's nice, honey. Does it come with a raise?" The year my work contributed to the prosecution of a man who had hidden $11 million in charitable foundations and defrauded investors across 3 provinces, my mother posted on Facebook the following week that Paige had been featured in a lifestyle magazine. She used 14 exclamation points. I remembered being 22 years old at the kitchen table, telling my mother I wanted to apply to the CRA's investigative stream. She looked at me the way you look at someone who's just announced they're going to try to become a professional mime. Not angry, gently baffled. "Leigh," she said, "government work is for people who couldn't get hired anywhere else. You're smarter than that." Beside her, Paige was reading a magazine and didn't look up. She never needed to say anything. My mother did the work. Paige just occupied the space my mother had decided she deserved. I sat in the driver's seat with both hands on the steering wheel. The afternoon had gone watery with that particular September light that comes off Lake Ontario sometimes, gray gold and diffuse, the kind that makes everything look like it's being lit for a photograph. I reached over to put my bag in the back seat and my hand touched something that had slid off the center console. A family photograph my mother had left in my car the previous month, tucked into an envelope with a note that said she'd had extras printed. I was at the left edge of the photograph. My mother's arm was around Paige's shoulder. My father stood behind them, 6 relatives clustered around the 2 of them like they were the gravitational center of the image, and everyone else was simply in orbit. I was at the edge, not because I'd chosen to stand apart, because that was the space remaining after everyone else had already arranged themselves around the people who mattered. I put the photograph in the glove compartment, not because I was throwing it away, because evidence is kept. Lawrence appeared at the passenger window and knocked twice. I didn't hear him approach. The window was up. I rolled it down. He stood at a distance, not close enough to press, far enough that I could start the engine and leave without explanation if I needed to. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "I just want you to know one thing." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it on the window frame. It was a printed copy of a citation, internal, not public, from the CRA dated 4 years earlier. The kind of document that lived in personnel files and was read by directors and never made it into the world. His name was on it as a reviewer, mine was on it as the recipient. "I kept a copy," he said, "because people in this work never see their own names anywhere. And I thought someone should hold a copy in a drawer somewhere that wasn't inside a government building." I looked at the citation for a long time. My hands were on the steering wheel. They didn't shake. But it took 3 full breaths before I could look up. "Why?" I asked. Not warmly. Investigator's voice. Lawrence smiled, something quiet and tired. "Because I've been doing this work long enough to know that the people who actually build the cases are never the ones holding the plaques at the press conferences." He folded the paper. "And I thought at least one person outside your unit should know exactly who you are." Something tightened in my chest. Not sadness, not relief, something older than both. While my mother was telling relatives I didn't know how to build a real life. While Paige was being photographed for lifestyle magazines. While my ex-partner was leaving because I worked too many hours and was, in his words, emotionally unavailable. Lawrence had been reading my citation in his study in Mississauga and keeping a copy in a drawer for 4 years, and I had never known. He shifted his weight. His tone changed, still quiet but something different behind it. Operational. There's a gala next month, he said. The Canadian Financial Crimes Prevention Council, their annual award dinner, corporate and charity sector, private donors, elected officials. A pause. The man receiving their Corporate Ethics Award this year is named Gareth Mould. The name landed in my chest like a stone dropping into still water. I know that name, I said. Flat, quiet. Lawrence looked at me steadily. I thought you might. I drove home in the dark with the citation in the passenger seat and my hands exactly at 10 and 2. I didn't turn on the radio, I needed the silence. Gareth Mould had been the CFO of a logistics company called Callaway Freight Solutions. 18 months ago, I had opened a file on Callaway Freight. 6 months after that, I had flagged it to my director as a matter requiring escalation, irregular flows through holding companies registered in Alberta and Nova Scotia, supplier invoices that didn't match. A charitable foundation in the company's name receiving substantial donations from entities the company claimed to have no relationship with. 2 months after that, the file was transferred to another team. I received no explanation. I asked twice. I was told it was a resource allocation decision. The file closed 8 weeks later without a charge. I'd read the closure summary 3 times. It cited insufficient evidence. There was sufficient evidence. I had built it. Gareth Mould had been nominated for the Corporate Ethics Award 6 weeks after the file closed. I sat at my kitchen table at midnight with the citation Lawrence had given me, a cup of tea that had gone cold, and a legal pad that was no longer blank. I wrote for 2 hours, not from memory. I didn't need memory. I'd kept my own copies, not from the CRA files, which I had no right to remove, but from the public records, the corporate registry filings, the registered charity information returns, the land title searches, the things that were always there if you knew how to read them. My phone rang. My director's name on the screen. I answered on the second ring. She said, Lawrence Okafor called me tonight. I said, I know. A pause. Then the Callaway file, yes. Another pause, longer. The closure decision came from above my level, Leigh. You know that? I know. But if someone were to present new analysis, structured as a public interest submission rather than an active file, through the right channels, I understand what you're saying. She was quiet for a moment. The gala is the 14th. Front row table has Lawrence's name on it. And mine. Another pause. There's a chair. I set the phone down, looked at the legal pad, looked at the public records I'd printed over the past 6 months and kept in a fire-safe box in my hallway closet, because I was the kind of person who kept things and I had not yet understood why. I thought I understood now. The following morning, I opened my wardrobe. My good blazer, charcoal wool, double-breasted, the kind of thing I'd bought years ago for testifying before a parliamentary committee and worn exactly 4 times. I pressed it the night before and hung it back carefully. I set out the folder I'd assembled through 3 evenings of working from public records alone. Everything documented, everything sourced, everything that could be verified by any person in any room who cared to look. My phone buzzed. A text from Paige. Mom is upset about how you left the christening. Can you just call her? I put the phone face down on the counter. 4 counts in, 4 counts hold, 4 counts out. Gareth Mould did not know I existed. That was the particular texture of this kind of work. The people you investigated rarely knew who you were until the moment they did. And by then, the question of what to do about it had already been answered. The gala was held at the Carlew in downtown Toronto. Chandeliers and marble floors, and the particular hum of 200 people who believed themselves to be in exactly the right room. I walked in with Lawrence, who wore the same dark gray jacket he'd worn to the christening, pressed now, his hands steady at his sides. I wore the charcoal blazer and carried the folder. The event coordinator at the entrance checked the list twice, looked at Lawrence, and let us through. We were at my director's table. My director Simone caught my eye from across the room and gave me a nod that didn't need words. I found Gareth Mould without trying. He was the way men like him always were at events like this, at the center of a cluster of people who were laughing at something he'd said, wearing the ease of a person who had spent so long being recognized that he'd stopped distinguishing between the recognition he'd earned and the recognition he'd bought. Salt and pepper hair, a charcoal suit nicer than mine, a smile that moved across the room like a warm front. He didn't recognize me. Why would he? He'd never seen my face. I sat at Simone's table and placed both hands flat on the surface and breathed. My phone buzzed. A text from my mother. Paige says you're still upset. Come for dinner Sunday. Let's talk. I turned the phone face down. Mould came to the table before the program started. I didn't know whether someone had told him I was there or whether his instincts were simply well calibrated enough to identify an unfamiliar face in a room where most people knew each other. He extended his hand across the table. I don't think we've met, warm, assured. The handshake of a man who believed handshakes could solve most problems. We haven't. I looked at his hand for 2 seconds, then shook it. Leigh Ardmore, Canada Revenue Agency. The warmth in his face didn't disappear immediately. It took approximately 3 seconds. His hand released mine slightly faster than a normal handshake ends. Wonderful, he said. His voice was still even. Good to see the public sector represented here. He turned and walked back toward the podium. His shoulders were carried 2 inches higher than they'd been when he approached. I watched him cross the room and take his position near the event coordinator. Lawrence leaned toward me. Your mother and sister are near the east entrance. I didn't turn my head. I'd seen them when I walked in. Paige told my mother where I was going tonight, I said. I know. He paused. Good. They should see this. The program opened with remarks from the council chair, a video presentation, testimonials from corporate partners, the particular language of these events, polished and generic, the vocabulary of people who had confused reputation for character. Mold took the stage for his award presentation to applause from 200 people. He was smooth at the podium, the practiced ease of someone who'd accepted enough recognition that the motions were automatic. He spoke about integrity, about accountability, about the responsibility of Canadian businesses to their communities and their stakeholders. He said the word integrity 4 times in 6 minutes. I didn't move, sat with my spine straight, hands flat on the table, watching the space between his collar and the microphone the way I watch spreadsheets, looking for the gap between what was claimed and what was documented. He felt the attention. I could tell from the way his eyes passed over our table and kept returning to it, and the way his grip on the podium tightened slightly on the third return. Then he said it. He said what the men like him always said when they felt the ground shift. The real threat to Canadian business integrity, he announced, voice settling into a note of measured gravitas, isn't external. It's internal. It's the culture of overreach. Investigators without accountability, bureaucrats who substitute ideology for evidence, regulatory bodies that pursue political agendas rather than genuine public protection. He looked, briefly and deliberately, at our table. We've all seen the damage done by accusations built on process rather than proof. He had just walked into the kill zone. He didn't know it yet. A chair scraped back from the table behind ours. A slow, deliberate sound, nothing theatrical about it. A woman named Beatrice Chen, who had been a Crown prosecutor in Ontario for 24 years and had retired the previous spring, rose to her feet. I was the lead prosecutor on the Meridian case, she said. Her voice carried the room without effort, the way voices do when they've spent decades in courtrooms. The evidentiary framework that allowed us to prosecute was built by a CRA investigator who was 31 years old at the time. The evidence was airtight. It was so precisely documented that defense counsel's primary strategy was delay, not dispute. She looked at me. I've been meaning to say that out loud, somewhere appropriate, for 4 years. The murmur that moved through the room was not quiet. From the third table, a man in his 50s whom I recognized as a former chair of the Financial Transactions and Reports Analysis Centre of Canada stood up. The public interest submission on Callaway Freight Solutions, filed through proper channels 3 weeks ago, has been formally received and is currently under independent review. He didn't look at Mold when he said it. He looked at Simone. The public record is extensive. A chartered accountant from the second row, a woman I'd worked with once, briefly, on a joint review, stood without speaking, just stood and looked at the stage, the way you look at something that is no longer what it claimed to be. And from the back of the room, near the east entrance, Lawrence's former partner from 22 years ago in the RCMP, a man named Dennis, who is still active, stood with his hands clasped in front of him. Meridian put 11 people in federal prison, he said. That doesn't happen without the analysis. The analysis was hers. Mold's hands were locked around the podium edge. The teleprompter had nothing that could help him. There was no aide moving toward the stage with an exit strategy. 200 people were watching his speech become something he hadn't written. Simone rose from her chair at the front of the room. She didn't raise her voice. She read from 2 documents. The first, the public registry filings and charity return data from Callaway Freight, organized into a 3-minute summary any accountant in the room could follow. The second, the formal notice of independent review, issued the previous Friday, containing the file number and reviewing body. Public record, verifiable. Nothing that couldn't be confirmed on any government database by anyone with internet access. There is a particular silence that comes after the last piece of evidence lands. It isn't stunned, it's rearranging. 200 people recalibrating the shape of the evening. I'd heard that silence in courtrooms. I'd heard it in boardrooms when the full spreadsheet was turned face up on the table. It was the silence of a version of events ceasing to be the operating assumption in the room. Mold stepped back from the podium, not dramatically, not with any particular collapse. He just stepped back, the way a person steps back from a door when they've realized they don't have the key. The woman in the wheelchair, she'd been at the far table, a disability rights advocate I recognized from a federal advisory committee, raised her right hand in a single quiet salute. A former public servant beside her did the same. Then Lawrence. Then Beatrice Chen. Then, one by one, without consultation or signal, other people around the room. Not applause, just acknowledgement. The particular weight of it, people choosing to stand in the direction of a thing that had been true for years and had simply, finally, been said out loud. I stood, heels together. I returned the acknowledgement. From the east entrance, I saw my mother slide down against the wall, her hand pressed against her mouth. She had seen everything. Beatrice's testimony, the documents, the formal notice, every person who'd stood. Paige was beside her phone at her side for once, her face stripped of the expression she'd been practicing since childhood. I didn't watch them for long. I turned back to face the room. 3 days later, there were 3 knocks at my apartment door. Soft, hesitant, the sound of a fist that wasn't sure of its welcome. I checked through the peephole. My mother stood in the hallway in a plain gray coat, no makeup to speak of, her hair simply pulled back. She was holding a tin, the kind with the tartan pattern on the lid that you find at every Canadian Christmas market, the shortbread tin she'd given to Paige every year at Christmas for as long as I could remember. Always Paige. Every year. The same tin. This was the first time in 38 years she'd brought it to my door. I stood on the inside with my hand on the deadbolt, took my breath count, then I opened the door, but I didn't step back. I stood in the frame with my body filling it, the way you stand when you're letting someone speak but not inviting them to stay. Leigh. Her voice fractured on the first syllable. I didn't know. I looked at her, not angry, not satisfied. Still as January ice on the Credit River. You didn't know, I said, or you chose not to ask. She started to speak. I didn't let her find her footing this time. I called you from Ottawa the night after the Meridian prosecution closed. I was sitting in a government building at 11 o'clock at night and I needed to tell someone. I told you we'd won. I told you 11 people had been convicted and $63 million recovered. I told you it had taken 4 years and I had been part of it. I paused. You said, "That's good, honey. Does this mean you can finally look for something with better hours?" She flinched. You had my phone number for 38 years, I said. Every transfer, every commendation, every time something happened that I needed you to ask about. You had the number. You chose not to dial it. She reached toward my arm. Give me a chance to understand. I stepped back 1 pace. Nothing theatrical. Practical. You don't need to understand me, I said. You need to feel better about what you chose. Those are different things. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Paige, calling. When I checked later, there was a text 3 minutes after the missed call. Mom is really upset. She's crying. Could you maybe ease up a little? Not one word about what I'd lived through, not one question about what had happened in the past 11 years. Just, could you be less inconvenient for the rest of us? That text was the last answer I needed. No contact was not a question I was still turning over. It was the conclusion of a very long analysis. Go home, I said to my mother, quietly, without cruelty, the voice of someone who had arrived at this point through years of careful thought, not the heat of a single evening. And don't come back. I closed the door. The deadbolt turned with a sound that was final in the way that only clear, correct decisions are final, not loud, just true. The following week, Gareth Mould requested a meeting through an intermediary. Neutral location, his preference. A Tim Hortons off the 401, which told me everything I needed to know about how much of his confidence had survived the previous week. No aide, no lawyer present at the table, just a 62-year-old man in a jacket that was too good for the booth he was sitting in, turning a paper coffee cup around in his hands. He admitted everything in the particular way that men like him admitted things, not with confession, but with inventory. He laid out each item flat, without expression. The relationships with the holding companies, the mechanism of the charity foundation, the conversations that had led to the file being transferred and closed. He spoke for 22 minutes. He didn't look at me directly for most of it. When he finished, he asked, "Why didn't you just go to the media?" I looked at him across the table. Because the media doesn't recover $63 million, I said. The court does. And because I have spent 11 years building things that last longer than a news cycle. The analysis exists. The public record exists. The review is underway. You will deal with what those things produce. I put $20 on the table for the coffees neither of us had finished and stood up. My existence, working, documented, unretracted, is the most complete answer to everything you tried to build, I said. You'll carry that. And there's no appeals process for what the record already shows. I walked out into a Tuesday afternoon on the 401 service road, gray sky, and the smell of exhaust and the particular ordinary texture of a day that had just become different from the one before it. The call from Lawrence came the following week. Not about mold, not about my mother, just a quiet voice. There's a group, he said. Public sect veterans, mostly. financial crimes, regulatory work, a few prosecutors. We meet at a church hall in Etobicoke on Thursday nights. Terrible coffee, good people. You want to come? I drove out in jeans and a fleece. The room was bright and a little too warm and smelled of coffee from an urn that had been bought used in 2003. 12 people in folding chairs. A table with a box of Timbits from the Rexall parking lot. No presentations, no protocols. Just people with specific expertise and particular kinds of damage sitting together because the alternative was sitting alone with it. I took the corner chair with my back to the wall and a clear line to both exits. The habit of 11 years. I had no plan to speak. I'd come because Lawrence asked. When the group turned to me, I looked around the circle. In the far chair, folded in on himself, was a young man in his late 20s. He worked in financial compliance, someone had said. Eyes on the floor. Shoulders curved inward the way they curve when something is pressing down from outside, and you've been trying to make yourself smaller than the pressure for long enough that it's become the default. I recognized the posture. I'd worn it in an Ottawa boardroom at 31 years old after a case I'd built for 4 years was attributed to a senior officer who hadn't looked at the file. I stood up. No notes. The hardest part isn't the investigation, I said. My voice came out slower than my usual register, without the clipped efficiency I used in briefings. The hardest part is when you go home and you can't explain to the people who are supposed to know you why the work matters, or why you stayed up until 3 in the morning in a government building working through a set of accounts that nobody else would look at. And you start to think that maybe they're right. Maybe the work doesn't count if the only people who know about it are other people in the same field. Maybe invisible is the same as nothing. The young man raised his eyes. I know who you are, he said. His voice came out scraped and raw. From the Meridian training materials, they reference the analysis framework. They don't use a name, but they use a name internally. He paused. Is it true they call you Meridian? I looked at him for a moment. Thought about how that had started. Someone in the unit had started using it as a reference in internal documents, a shorthand, and then it had spread the way these things spread in small professional communities until it was just a thing. Some people, I said. Doesn't that just mean a dividing line? He asked. The line between things? I looked at him. For the first time that night, maybe the first time in more years than I could account for, I felt something that wasn't strategic. It was simpler than that. It was the feeling of having been exactly where someone else was standing, and knowing the only thing that had changed was time. That's exactly what it means, I said. Before and after, visible and invisible, the point at which something that was hidden becomes the thing the record shows. I paused. For the people I worked alongside, the analysts, the prosecutors, the ones who never got a press release, that name meant we found the line, we held it, and eventually we made it visible. His face shifted. Something behind his eyes changed, not better, not fixed, but altered. The way the quality of a room changes when one window comes open. Around the circle, a few of the older people nodded. The slow, weighted nod of people who have been carrying a specific kind of knowledge alone for a long time and recognize when someone else is holding it too. I sat back down in the corner chair. Back to the wall, both exits visible, the Timbits were gone. The coffee urn was running low. I drove home on the Gardiner with the windows down, the particular October cold that comes off Lake Ontario, pressing through the gap. Not warm, not comfortable, but real in the way cold things are real. No radio. Just the highway and the city lights reflected off the water. I thought about my mother sitting in the Brampton house, where the family photo still hung in the front hallway. The one where my father's arm was around Paige, and 6 people were clustered around the 2 of them, and I stood at the left edge in the space that was left after everyone had already found their position. I didn't know whether she'd taken it down. I found I didn't need to know. I thought about Gareth Mould driving to whatever appointment came after a Tim Hortons in which he'd spent 22 minutes emptying his pockets. I thought about Paige somewhere composing a text designed to make this everyone else's problem. I thought about the review that was underway, the documents that existed, the record that had never been retracted and never would be. Each of them was operating inside a version of events that the public record had already corrected. That was enough. That was, it turned out, exactly enough. The highway opened up past the Spadina exit, and the lake spread out to the south, black and wide and indifferent in the way large bodies of water are indifferent. Not hostile, not cold, just enormously unconcerned with the things that happen on the shore. I had spent 11 years building cases that outlasted the people who tried to erase them. I had spent 38 years in a family that looked at that work and saw nothing. I had spent 3 months watching a man receive awards for a version of integrity he had abandoned before I ever opened his file. All of it was on the record now, not because someone had rescued me, not because I had finally broken and said the right thing at the right volume, because I had simply kept working, kept building, kept documenting, and the record, when it came, spoke in a language no one in that gala room or that christening kitchen could talk over or redirect or perform around. The quiet inside the car wasn't loneliness anymore. It was the particular stillness that comes after a long case closes and the documentation is filed and the work is done, not forever, not perfectly, but correctly. The kind of quiet that comes when you've done the thing you were there to do and done it without cutting corners, and the outcome is in the record where it belongs. Meridian, in the end, was at rest.